I'm 75 now, and I can't remember anybody except the Queen being.
The pen was already in Charles's hand. The authorization had been prepared, the private access arrangements were waiting, and Camilla stood on the verge of receiving unrestricted entry to one of the monarchy's most emotionally guarded estates. Then Edward stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. With one firm objection, the king's younger brother stopped the signature and turned a private family concession into a confrontation over loyalty, memory, and royal authority. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles had believed the meeting would end with one stroke of ink. Balmoral, the private Scottish estate associated with family summers and memories of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, was not merely another royal residence. Its protected rooms carried letters and promises made when the crown felt less like power and more like family. Edward entered the study expecting discussion, not a decision. His eyes settled on the authorization beside the monarch's hand, and uncertainty hardened into alarm. The document would grant the Queen Consort access to Balmoral's private family wing and reserved rooms without approval from senior relatives and estate trustees. Those trustees protected parts of the property and enforced internal agreements. Camilla understood instantly. She had seen the authorization as more than permission to cross a threshold. To her, it ended the suggestion that she remained a guest inside her husband's family. Now Edward's objection made that acceptance feel like humiliation delivered before the king. Charles looked up, waiting for his younger brother to step back. Edward did the opposite. He placed 2 fingers against the paper and said the authorization could not proceed because consultation had never taken place. The monarch's face tightened. Slowly, he lowered the pen. Silence carried the shock neither brother would voice. Charles possessed authority over royal arrangements, but even he could not erase agreements covering private apartments, archives, and rooms preserved after their mother's death. Edward had not merely interrupted a favor, he had challenged how the decision had been made. Camilla remained still as anger and embarrassment collided beneath her composure. Charles had promised that this signature would remove a barrier. Instead, the unsigned page exposed how the family guarded the world Queen Elizabeth had left behind. Edward revealed that procedure was only part of his objection. Months earlier, a sealed Balmoral room, a private request from Camilla, and a promise made after their mother's death had changed everything. The stopped signature was shocking, but the danger lay in what each person believed Balmoral represented, and none was prepared to surrender that belief quietly. For Charles, the authorization was an act of devotion. For Camilla, it was proof that she would never again be treated as a visitor inside her husband's family. But for Edward, the same document threatened to erase a boundary created by grief, memory, and promises that had never been written into law. 3 people stood inside the same room. Yet each was fighting for a different version of the monarchy, and only one of them had dared to stop the king. Charles looked at his younger brother with wounded disbelief. Balmoral was not simply a house he had inherited. It was a responsibility passed to him with the crown, the institution that gave him the authority to act as Britain's sovereign. He believed that responsibility included deciding who could enter its private spaces, and granting the Queen Consort greater access felt like correcting years in which she had been accepted publicly but kept at a distance privately. Camilla stood near the fireplace and said nothing. She listened as the king demanded to know why Edward had waited until the final moment to object. Her expression remained controlled, but her hands tightened when the protected wing was described as a place she had never been approved to enter. She had believed the document would finally close that painful chapter. Instead, it had exposed the rejection more sharply than before. Edward felt the weight of every second. As Queen Elizabeth II's youngest son, he had spent much of his life avoiding open conflict, especially with his elder brother. Yet he also remembered how carefully their mother had guarded certain rooms, papers, and personal spaces. Silence now would not feel like loyalty to Charles, it would feel like betrayal of her. Charles suddenly asked whether William had encouraged the objection. The question carried more than suspicion. It revealed his fear that the future king had quietly opened another front against him. Edward answered at once. He had come alone. No message had been sent by the prince, no private instruction had been given, and no wider plan stood behind him. He accepted full responsibility. Edward then removed a folded memorandum from his coat. The internal document, meaning a private written record used to guide royal household decisions, stated that access to the reserved rooms required consultation with designated family representatives. Charles read the passage once, then again. His confidence faded, replaced by irritation he could no longer hide. But Edward warned that the memorandum was only the surface. His true reason began months earlier, when Camilla asked to enter a room Queen Elizabeth had deliberately kept closed. To understand why he had finally defied his brother, the story had to return to the day that locked Balmoral door turned a quiet disagreement into a promise no one could safely ignore. Months before Edward stopped the king's pen, a smaller confrontation unfolded in a silent Balmoral corridor. No public announcement followed. No formal complaint was issued. Yet those who witnessed it understood that a line had been crossed. Camilla had asked for access to a private room preserved after Queen Elizabeth's death. The request itself was not the point of no return. What changed everything was Charles's answer and Edward's discovery that a family promise could disappear with a single royal instruction. Grief had given those rooms a different kind of power. After the late Queen's death, several spaces containing letters, photographs, clothing, family papers, and personal gifts were temporarily sealed, so relatives could decide what should be archived, retained, or transferred. Nothing deeply personal would be disturbed until the family had been consulted. Edward had taken part in those discussions with Sophie, his wife and trusted confidant. She understood why the promise mattered, and he believed Charles understood it too. The king had accepted the arrangement, giving his younger brother reason to treat it as a solemn commitment between children protecting their mother's private world. Then came the visit that changed everything. Camilla asked Charles for permission to enter Queen Elizabeth's sealed morning room, so she could consider whether it might become part of her future use of Balmoral. The morning room was a private sitting space used early in the day, and it still held possessions that had not been reviewed. Edward reached the corridor as an aide prepared the key. Shock crossed his face when he saw the Queen Consort waiting beside the door. He asked whether Anne, William, and the other relatives had been consulted. Camilla answered that the monarch had approved the visit, and she expected that decision to be enough. Charles arrived moments later and insisted that the family could not keep every room frozen forever. Edward answered quietly that their mother's belongings remained inside, and that opening the door without consultation would break the agreement. Sophie's earlier warning returned to him. Once one boundary fell, the others would become easier to erase. The king finally withdrew the instruction, but the damage had been done. Camilla walked away without entering, wounded by a rejection witnessed by only a few people, but felt with crushing force. Edward later gave Anne a direct promise during a private recorded conversation. He would stop any permanent access change made without consultation. Now the broader authorization proved Charles had tried to move around that understanding. The locked room had created the wound. The unsigned document tore it open, and when the monarch ordered his brother to remain behind, the dispute became a reckoning neither man could avoid. The room emptied until only Charles and Edward remained. Camilla had withdrawn, the aides had closed the doors, and the disputed paper still rested between the two brothers. Then the king gave a direct instruction: remove the objection and allow the authorization to proceed. Edward did not move. For years, he had yielded to rank, age, and duty. Now he stood across from the sovereign, refusing the simplest command because obedience would cost him something he could never recover. Charles treated the matter as an ordinary household decision distorted by family resistance. The authorization, a written order granting specific permission, would allow his wife to enter spaces within an estate governed during his reign. To him, Camilla should not be forced to seek approval every time she crossed another private threshold inside her husband's home. Edward refused to accept that comparison. Ordinary residence access was one thing. Entry to rooms preserving Queen Elizabeth's letters, possessions, and private family history was another. He reminded his brother that kingship could change titles and responsibilities, but it could not erase promises made between grieving children after their mother's death. Charles reached toward the page. His voice hardened as he told Edward to move his hand and end the obstruction. The younger brother slowly obeyed, but before the monarch could recover the document, he slid it away from the waiting pen. The gesture was controlled, almost quiet. Its meaning was not. Physical obedience would not become moral surrender. Charles accused him of treating Camilla as though she could never be worthy of full acceptance. Edward answered that her worth was not the issue. The method was. His brother had prepared the access privately, avoided consultation, and attempted to reverse an agreement he had previously accepted. Edward mentioned their mother again, and anger suddenly gave way to pain. Charles asked whether Queen Elizabeth's memory would now be used against every choice he made. He had inherited the throne, yet he still felt judged by a past no decision could satisfy. Then Edward disclosed the step that changed the battle. Through a documented submission, he had already sent a copy of the authorization to Balmoral's legal advisor for procedural review. That review meant an official examination of whether the order followed existing estate agreements. Even if Charles signed the original, the decision could no longer disappear into private household business. The king understood the danger immediately. His brother had created a formal record, proving the sovereign had been warned before proceeding. Charles declared that he would discover who truly controlled Balmoral, but the answer rested with trustees, agreements, and family consent beyond either brother's command. The crown might settle many disputes. This one had already moved outside its reach. Behind Balmoral's stone walls existed a quieter structure of power: estate advisors, custodians, family representatives, legal arrangements, and private understandings inherited across generations. Charles wore the crown, but even the sovereign could not transform every family space with a gesture. As the disputed authorization reached review, one nervous advisor opened the old access records and discovered that Edward's objection rested on more than sentiment. A forgotten approval requirement had survived, and it could invalidate everything Charles intended to grant. Margaret Ellison sat alone with the authorization, and the earlier agreement spread across her desk. As Balmoral's senior legal advisor, she was responsible for explaining how estate rules applied, even when the answer displeased the monarch. The king held broad authority over royal residences, but protected archives, inherited personal belongings, preserved rooms, and areas covered by temporary family access agreements could carry separate restrictions. Margaret understood the danger immediately. If she treated the document as ordinary household permission, Camilla could receive access to almost every area named within it. If she treated it as an attempt to enter protected family spaces, Charles would need consultation before the order could take effect. Either answer would wound someone powerful. Charles summoned the advisor and demanded clarity. He did not threaten her, but the pressure in his words was unmistakable. The monarch wanted to know whether his own residence could truly contain rooms beyond his immediate control. Margaret answered carefully, aware that Edward waited elsewhere for the same judgment and that her professional duty was now being tested against royal expectation. Camilla learned through a private household briefing that the scope of her access was under legal examination. She felt less like the queen consort, and more like an applicant asking permission to enter her husband's home. Her title had brought ceremony, duty, and public recognition, yet Balmoral still seemed to measure belonging by memories she had not shared. Margaret finally delivered her documented opinion. Charles could grant his wife general residence access, allowing her to live, host, and move through the estate's shared areas. He could not, however, open the sealed family rooms or give unrestricted use of the protected wing while the temporary agreement remained active. The deeper discovery was devastating. The authorization had been written so broadly that staff could have treated the king's signature as permission to unlock every restricted space named within it. Edward's intervention had prevented that interpretation before it became action. Charles now faced the consequence alone. His brother had been proven right, but that victory carried a painful cost. The authorization had to be narrowed, and the monarch would have to tell Camilla that the promise he made could not be fulfilled. Edward had won the procedural battle, but behind a closed door, she was about to learn that Balmoral remained divided between the places she could enter and the memories she could not. Camilla received the decision not in a council chamber, but in the privacy of her sitting room. Charles entered carrying the amended authorization, though he did not immediately hand it to her. She understood before he spoke. The access he had promised would now be restricted, the sealed rooms would remain beyond her reach, and Edward's objection had prevailed. For the Queen, the deepest wound was not the locked door. It was realizing that her husband could not open it without reopening his entire family's grief. Charles placed the revised document before her and explained what remained possible. Camilla could reside at Balmoral, host guests in designated areas, and use the principal household spaces, but the protected family wing and sealed rooms would remain closed. The authorization, a written order defining what someone may officially do, had been narrowed to respect the existing family agreement. Camilla read each line slowly. When she reached the restricted access clause, she turned the page face down and allowed the silence to linger. Then she asked whether Edward now decided where the Queen was permitted to walk. Her voice remained calm, but the question carried years of wounded pride. Charles answered that his brother had exposed a genuine procedural flaw. Camilla looked directly at him and said procedure had become the family's safest language for rejection. It allowed them to deny her, while avoiding the harder truth that some still accepted her title without accepting her presence inside their most private memories. The king felt the accusation land. He wanted to defend his wife, yet he could no longer deny that he had moved too quickly. His promise to protect her had once again collided with responsibilities to his siblings, his sons, and the family history they believed he was rushing to rearrange. Camilla finally explained why the morning room mattered. During an earlier private conversation, Charles had suggested it might one day become a shared retreat where they could escape ceremony and duty. She had never intended to remove Queen Elizabeth's belongings or erase her presence. She had wanted to enter because her husband had made the room sound like part of their future. Charles could no longer hide the final truth. He admitted that he had drafted the broader authorization without consulting Edward, Anne, or William because he expected resistance. The missing approval had not been an accident. It had been a deliberate attempt to avoid another painful family argument. Camilla absorbed the confession, but she did not demand that he overrule the decision. Instead, she asked to meet Edward alone. Documents had deepened the wound. Only honesty might close it. The authorization had failed, the marriage had absorbed the blow, and now the two people most hurt by the dispute would meet without Charles, without advisors, and without rank to protect them. No aides entered the room. Charles was not present to defend his wife, and no legal advisor stood beside Edward to justify his objection. For the first time since the halted signature, Camilla and the king's younger brother faced each other without an institutional shield. She expected judgment. He expected anger. Instead, the conversation began with a confession. Camilla admitted that every locked royal door still reminded her of the years when she was permitted near the family, but never fully welcomed inside it. Edward had agreed to meet because the dispute had become dangerously personal. Protecting Queen Elizabeth's rooms was never meant to become a permanent declaration that the Queen Consort had no rightful place at Balmoral. Yet he knew his intervention had made her feel exactly that. Camilla explained that expanded access had represented acceptance after years of scrutiny, public hostility, and conditional belonging. Entering the private wing beside Charles would have proved that his relatives no longer saw her as someone standing just beyond the family's inner circle. Losing that access had reopened every old wound. Then she disclosed something Edward had not expected. During their private conversation, Camilla said she had not known the morning room still contained unopened correspondence, personal gifts, and possessions awaiting family review. She had believed the space was largely empty, and that Charles had already settled its future. Edward studied her reaction and understood that the king had not fully explained why the room remained sealed. The family review, a formal process in which relatives decide how private belongings and spaces should be handled, had never been presented to her as unfinished grief. It had sounded like a barrier that her husband could simply remove. Edward admitted his own truth. Seeing Camilla beside the locked door had filled him with fear that his mother's presence was being cleared away before the family was ready. His resistance had been shaped by procedure, but it had also been driven by grief he had never fully named. Camilla told him that stopping the signature had shamed her, yet she conceded that Charles should never have bypassed consultation. Her anger began to shift. Edward had not created the secrecy. He had exposed it. Edward offered a compromise. The protected rooms would remain sealed until the family completed its review, but Camilla would take part in that process, rather than remain outside it. She agreed not to seek special access beforehand. In return, he promised to make clear that his objection concerned the authorization, not her right to belong at Balmoral. Their agreement built the first fragile bridge across the crisis. But beyond the palace walls, the story had already escaped. Headlines were turning Edward's quiet refusal into a national judgment on Charles, Camilla, and the limits of royal power. By morning, the private disagreement had escaped the palace. Broadcasters spoke of a brother blocking a king. Commentators argued over Camilla's place inside the royal family, while crowds outside Balmoral debated whether its locked rooms belonged to a living monarch or to the memory of the woman who came before him. The family's compromise remained unknown. What the world saw was simpler and more brutal. Edward had stopped Charles, and one unsigned page had exposed every unresolved fracture beneath the crown. The story had become larger than access to a house. Charles's authority, Edward's resistance, and Queen Elizabeth's private legacy were now being judged together. Balmoral represented family memory as much as royal power, and the argument over its protected rooms forced the public to ask whether a sovereign could act alone when grief and shared inheritance stood in the way. Palace officials issued a statement saying the estate's household arrangements were undergoing a routine family review. That review meant a process for deciding how rooms, possessions, and access should be managed. But the careful wording failed because it never denied that Edward had stopped the authorization. London woke to a front page that captured the crisis in one blow. A photograph showed the king's younger brother arriving at an engagement beneath the headline, "The Brother Who Said No." Beside it, Balmoral's gates appeared under the words, "Queen's Private Rooms at Heart of Palace Clash." Edward saw the newspaper while preparing to leave. He did not feel victorious. He told Sophie that he had never wanted to become a rebel standing against Charles, and she reminded him that protecting a promise was not the same as attacking a brother. Still, the public praise unsettled him because every celebration of his courage seemed to deepen the king's humiliation. Camilla faced a harsher judgment. She listened as a television panel debated whether she should ever enter Queen Elizabeth's private spaces. When one commentator described her as permanently outside the late monarch's inner circle, she switched off the screen. The old wound had returned, only now the entire country was watching it bleed. Charles was urged through a communications briefing to issue a stronger defense of his authority. He refused after learning of the agreement reached between his wife and Edward. Escalation would destroy the fragile understanding they had found. Edward then approved a clarification stating that Camilla's general access to Balmoral had never been opposed. His objection concerned only restricted rooms and the existing family review. The public story began to shift, but one decision remained. Charles still had to choose whether his brother's intervention was disloyalty or the act that had saved him from a deeper mistake. Charles returned to the same desk where the crisis had begun. The original authorization remained unsigned, its sweeping promise now replaced by a narrower agreement, shaped by grief, resistance, and an unexpected act of honesty. Edward entered expecting a reprimand. Camilla arrived knowing the final decision would define more than her access to Balmoral. This time, the king did not reach for the old document. He folded it once, placed it aside, and acknowledged that the boundary his brother defended had been necessary. Charles formally withdrew the original authorization and approved the revised arrangement. Camilla would receive full access to Balmoral's shared residential and official spaces, but the sealed private rooms would remain protected until the family review was complete. That review was a formal process through which relatives and estate advisors would decide the future of Queen Elizabeth's preserved rooms, possessions, and private papers. The king confirmed that Camilla, Edward, Anne, William, and the relevant advisors would all take part. No single person, not even the sovereign, would privately decide what happened to spaces carrying the late Queen's most personal memories. Authority remained with Charles, but responsibility would now be shared. Charles placed the unsigned authorization inside a file marked as withdrawn. Then he turned to his younger brother and admitted what pride had previously prevented him from saying. He should have consulted the family before making a promise he did not possess the moral freedom to fulfill alone. Edward felt no triumph. He told Charles that stopping him had been one of the hardest decisions he had ever made. Protecting their mother's memory should never have required humiliating Camilla, damaging trust, or forcing two brothers into open confrontation. Camilla accepted the revised access without protest. She told Edward that she now understood his objection had never been a declaration that she did not belong. He answered that Balmoral was her home, even if certain rooms had to remain untouched until the family was ready. Charles finally admitted through that private conversation that avoiding resistance had created the very conflict he feared. By bypassing approval, he had made his wife more vulnerable, wounded his brother, and transformed a manageable family discussion into a royal crisis. Edward's intervention had not weakened the monarchy. It had shown that loyalty sometimes demands resistance. Grief cannot be erased by rank, and royal authority becomes stronger when it accepts principled limits. The crisis ended with Camilla recognized, Edward's promise preserved, and Queen Elizabeth's private legacy protected. The pen that never touched the page became the symbol of the entire moment. A king restrained, a brother finally heard, a queen no longer treated as an intruder, and a monarchy reminded that protecting its future sometimes begins by respecting the rooms its past has asked to keep closed. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.